What's going on, folks? Ted from Immersion here, and I wanted to touch on the announcement from Critical Role's Darrington Press from last week about the two new TTRPGs that they're working on, as well as to talk about what kind of larger impact this could have on the TTRPG space as a whole. So if you like what I'm talking about here, I haven't done one of these in a little while, so forgive me, but if you like what I do here and you like the channel and all that good stuff, consider subscribing. Again, simple click for you. Does a lot of stuff for me, drives this number up. I wish this could count live, but that's just how the algorithm for it works. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump in. This is the announcement. Now, there is a video here, but basically all we want to talk about can be pulled from just the statement here, right? So again, one, they're going to be at Gen Con, which is a pretty cool thing. Critical Role has been at Gen Con in the past, although not, I guess, in a Darrington Press aspect. They have, I recall, a couple years back, for the 50th anniversary of Gen Con, that may have been, I think, the first Critical Role live show. I actually did attend that one in person. So that was but Critical Role was there, and I think they were releasing the first iteration of the Tal'Dorei campaign guide was at Gen Con. But Critical Role, or at least Darrington Press, didn't exist, and they weren't there in an official publisher capacity, but now they are. So what's coming from Darrington Press that we're talking about here? There is Queen by Midnight, which is a board game, but what we're really focused on here are these two new RPGs. So it says releasing in the next year, so it is April now, and I think that's by design, and we'll talk about it. And we're super excited to preview both online and IRL this year at Gen Con. They do have plans to preview both of these new RPG systems at Gen Con, and this could possibly get some folks shaking in their boots. So let's talk about it. The first is called Illuminated Worlds, a D6 dice pool system designed for shorter arc-driven campaigns and packaged in a way that it can be used with any type of setting that you can think of. And then it goes on to say it's created by two incredible game designers. And again, I'm sorry if I butcher your names here. Stras Asimovic and Layla Adelman. Okay, so we don't really know if this seems like a or a setting agnostic system. It's a dice pool system as well, which is not something completely original, where other systems have dice pools in a variety. I mean, the one that I'm playing currently is the West End Ghostbusters game from 1984. That was a D6 dice pool system. World of Darkness. I've been playing the Army of Darkness game recently too, but the World of Darkness system is a D10 dice pool system. So again, for shorter arc-driven campaigns. So this sounds more of like a potentially lightweight, fun system. I'm curious how a system can be designed for shorter campaigns. Now, maybe you guys have more experience on this with this than I do, but I don't know exactly how that would work. But the benefit here is that it's setting agnostic. So this could cover sci-fi, future, post-apocalyptic, fantasy, modern, whatever you want. And that's a pretty smart move because it gets them to have the ability to cover all the other things. And the fact that their Critical Role gives the potential to hit a bunch of different aspects. And then secondly is another new one called a Daggerheart, a fun and fresh update to the fantasy genre of RPGs that is designed for long-term campaign play and character progression. All but coming out and saying this is the competitor to Dungeons & Dragons. So, a couple of things here. One, this is clearly, they said within the next year. I think this is attempting to potentially, it could be wrong, to beat out the competition, right? We know that Wizards of the Coast is doing their 2024 rules update at some point, working on it through this year and at some point next year. We know that MCDM is working on their system. We know that Cobalt Press is doing Tales of the Valiant. There are some other fantasy games coming out there, right? Like, it's in beta right now, but Free League released Dragonbane, which is also a fantasy system. And I'm sure there are others out there that I'm just not remembering off the top of my head. But if you're trying to get yours to market in the next year, that means my assumption is to try to beat out everybody else and get it to market and get it out. Now, who knows how long this has been in development in the playtest side. Critical Role and Darrington Press have been around for a while. I'm sure they've been playtesting this behind the scenes, behind closed doors. They also have a lot of friends in the TTRPG space, kind of the bigger companies and things and bigger streams. So they have a large pool of people to play test with. So there's that. So what could this mean for the TTRPG space as a whole? It's hard to say. So I've had a lot of conversations with folks over the years. Was what is the next campaign of Critical Role going to be run in? And that, I think, would largely drive the market to a new system potentially. So we know that Dungeons and Dragons is bigger than it's ever been. WotC missteps here and there with notwithstanding. And a large portion of that, whether you like Critical Role or not, can be attributed to Critical Role. It can also be attributed to things like Stranger Things. But Critical Role's been around for a while. You know, they still pull in, I think, what is it, 40,000 people every Thursday night when they stream or broadcast the live recordings. So there's a large fan base there. And I think a lot of folks, content creators that you may watch currently, only got into the world of Dungeons and Dragons at all because of watching Critical Role. So it's definitely pulled a lot of people in and helped enrich the TTRPG space for sure. Now, if the first season of Critical Role, and maybe not even so much the first season since they were still kind of getting their legs, but I think everything really took off a lot more when the second season aired. But second season, even the most recent third season, if that had taken place and they'd used a new system or not a new system, a different system. Let's say they chose, Morkborg or Call of Cthulhu or Pathfinder. You can bet that a lot of the Critical Role fans, whether veteran Critical Role fans or brand new ones just coming to it right out the gate because their friend says, you got to check it out, it's really cool. And they're like, oh, they're playing Pathfinder. Well, then they started with Pathfinder, but either way, they're playing Pathfinder. Pathfinder sales are going to go through the roof, and a lot more people are going to want to play Pathfinder because Critical Role is playing Pathfinder, right? They may try to emulate the characters that they see on the show or otherwise. Now, we don't know if Critical Role has any sort of behind-the-scenes contracts with Wizards of the Coast. We know they've done 2 books with them. There may be more books coming in the future. Doesn't sound like it for 2023 based on what we've heard, unless Matt and the Critical Role team are working on some of the books that are releasing this year. I feel like that's a big selling point. They probably would have announced that up front if that was the case. Either way. So they may, I thought for sure that season 3 of Critical Role was going to be in some other system, but it ended up being in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. Now, when they get around to campaign 4, I'll be honest, I haven't kept up at all with campaign 3, so I don't know if they're close to the end or very far away from it. But perhaps they will just, when Critical Role campaign 3 ends and campaign 4 starts, I would warrant that they're going to start it in Daggerheart unless they have some, obligation contractually to do it in another system. The other thing is, potentially, they could transition their characters to Daggerheart once Daggerheart is in its full release or in a well-developed enough beta to release, right? They started off originally playing Pathfinder in their home games and then transitioned to 5e when they brought it to stream. What could that mean, right? If Critical Role Campaign 4 is in Daggerheart and all of their streams going forward seem like they're going to be in that, I think you're going to see a pretty big dip in people wanting to play Dungeons and Dragons and a pretty big spike in people wanting to play Daggerheart, assuming the system is good. Now, there will be a lot of people that probably just want to play it because it's made by Critical Role, but I also assume that the game will be designed well. The question is, how different is it? We kind of are in the back and forth situation currently with Tales of the Valiant, the Critical Role version. The Critical Role, the Kobold Press 5e sort of clone, if you will. And they're, obviously based in the same system. Is Daggerheart going to be using stuff from the SRD 5.1? I highly doubt it, but they have every right to because SRD 5.1 has found its way into Creative Commons, and also they've built up their career as Critical Role with D&D 5e. So this could be their version and they take it and tweak it and adjust it. Or it could be something, and what I'm assuming it's going to be is something entirely new, but still based in that fantasy genre. So we could potentially see, I'm not going to call it a mass exodus, but definitely an exodus of people playing Dungeons and Dragons and shifting over to this Daggerheart system. It's obviously made by the folks at Critical Role, so you know that character progression, backstories, and all that kind of aspects of role-playing will be a large portion of this system. I imagine that's going to be one of the core functions of it, is how you go about role-playing and making it all about the characters. And I'm assuming combat will be interesting as well, but I think potentially in my head, combat's more of a back burner to the RP side of things. Although, again, I could be wrong. And who knows, right? We might get a chance to see it at Gen Con, and it might blow us out of the water with how amazing this thing is. Like, it could be the next, like, how did nobody think to do XYZ before? Daggerheart is clearly the winner. It's the one that's it'll be the D&D killer, right? You know, we hear that all the time with video games. What's gonna be the next WoW killer, or this, that, and the other thing? Maybe Daggerheart is the D&D killer. Who knows? But, like I said, if they decide to start playing their games in it, and people still find the show and the characters and the cast as interesting as they have consistently for the past however long Critical Role has been around, I can imagine that people are going to want to switch to play Daggerheart, because whether, again, it's to do things like support Critical Role or just to play the same game that the show is playing in their campaigns. It also might be part of it might also be, you'll get it under, like, you'll better understand the show you're watching if you also understand the rules of the game that they're playing, which I think is definitely, some people enjoy that. It'll also be interesting to see what happens with, like, sponsorships and digital tool sets. We obviously know Critical Role has a big, or I don't know about right now, but they did have a very big history with D&D Beyond, and that allowed them to digitally manage their character sheets. How will Daggerheart work? Will that be something that's handled in Alchemy or Demiplane or something like that? So they'll have a way to manage the digital tool set for their characters, especially for things like overlays and whatnot on their stream. Who knows? But the other thing I want to talk about is how we kind of got to this point. Now, I had always in the back of my mind figured at some point Critical Role was going to just branch out and do their own RPG system at a point, because, they're making all of their stuff in Dungeons and Dragons, and if they had their own system and were doing it that way, then all of that profit goes to them. And, again, at the end of the day, Critical Role is a company, but the reason we got here, and this is something I think I talked about in my video about Open D&D back in December before all of the OGL drama began, was that one of the things that could happen if the OGL that we were hearing rumors was going to happen actually came through was this concept of splintering. And I think that's where we're at, right? And if everything was handled well and the OGL drama didn't blow up the way it did, everyone probably would have continued to do what they were doing, continue to create for 5e, and just do what they were doing. But because of the fear of losing all of that, sprung up overnight, and again was subsequently quelled a little bit later with the release of 5.1 to the Creative Commons, instead of nobody ever felt comfortable to go back to Wizards of the Coast wholeheartedly, and that led to a lot of the things that we're seeing. But it's led to this splintering. You have D&D 5e with its 2024 rules update coming down the road. Cobalt Press branching out and doing Tales of the Valiant, their sort of 5e version there. You still have mainstays that exist out there like Pathfinder. You have MCDM now going to do their own system. Critical Role's going to do their own system. I'm sure there are others that I'm missing out on. Then you have other things like Free League bringing Dragonbane into beta here, which again is it's an older game, but they're updating it to be more modern. That is also a fantasy replacement game, and there are other ones out there that I'm not remembering off the top of my head. So now, instead of having one central game, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, that everybody's creating for, now everybody has splintered off to make their own games. And I'm not sure it's the best thing, but it remains to be seen. Because where we used to have everybody was making all for the same system, I might decide that I really like Tales of the Valiant, and I'm going to make all of my future content of creation stuff that I put out there all for Tales of the Valiant. You might make it for Daggerheart. Again, assuming that's even an option that you have, because let us not forget that we don't know what the situation will be with Daggerheart. It may have an open game license. It may have no license at all. You may not be able to profit on it in any way. I think that would be a foolish move, given the fact that all the flack WotC got from trying to change the OGL that existed to the one they were attempting to make. And I think the reason that everybody's kind of, again, doing what they're doing here is in the aftermath of the OGL. But for all intents and purposes, Daggerheart could have its entirely own OGL system that has its own rules of how you can monetize. I think, again, if something does get developed, I absolutely will review that with probably Noah as a lawyer to get you a lawyer's perspective on it. They could also put Daggerheart into the Orc license or some other license that they make up, or some other license that somebody else makes up. But ultimately, there will likely be something restricting what you can and cannot do if you decide you want to make stuff and profit on it. Again, share and share alike content that you make for free and just put it out on the internet. You don't really have to worry about stuff. But again, all remains to be seen. But now creators have choices of what they want to make. Do you want to make your content for this or that or whatever you want to make it for? But that involves potentially you as the creator either having to, bet on one horse and just ride that out and hope it does well, or learn to decouple yourself from mechanics so that you can make content for all of the different systems. Also learn the systems enough to be able to do that, and then release it on multiple options. Again, if that's an option to you, potentially where you release it may restrict how many other places you could post it. But at the same time, we might also, like I said, we might see the play of Dungeons and Dragons dip down because of this Daggerheart game, or MCDMs for that matter. And ultimately, potentially, some of these could fizzle out and die. Now, do I think something like Dungeons and Dragons will completely rock bottom and disappear completely? No, I think it has the name. And I think, honestly, just the power of the name Dungeons and Dragons keeps it alive a lot longer than it will probably, potentially would ever need to be, just because it has the history there. But, I don't know. And I also, personally, like, now that there are so many fantasy genre RPGs, I feel like there's no, in my mind personally, I wouldn't want to play multiple, like, fantasy genre games. Like, if I'm gonna, hitch my horse to Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, which, history dictates I have, because that's what I've been doing here on the channel for a long time. But let's say I do that. I'm gonna play multiple campaigns a week. I'd probably prefer, if I'm gonna play in a fantasy genre game, for that system to be, to have one system. So I can at least have my, hey, I'm playing a fantasy game. I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons. I know the rules. But I personally think I'd have a really hard time if I was playing like Daggerheart on Mondays, Dungeons and Dragons on Thursdays, and I don't know, MCDMs or Tales of the Valiant on Wednesdays, and I have to manage 3 different fantasy games in my headspace, remembering the different lores, the different rules, as well as all that, stuff together, and still playing in fantasy. I have an easier time separating out, like if I'm going to be playing Dungeons and Dragons on Wednesday and Avatar Legends on Monday, I can play multiple games in multiple systems because they're different enough in my head that I can focus on things a little easier. But if I'm going to play a bunch of fantasy games, I'd probably just like to pick one. And again, maybe that's just me and that's personal preference. I don't know. But, ultimately, could one of these systems win out and then the other ones fall by the wayside? Yeah, and will you have splinter cells of those groups that will continue to play them long after they potentially fail? Absolutely. There's still people playing 1st edition Dungeons and Dragons out there because they like the way it was handled, and that's what they like to play. And that's entirely up to you. But I'm curious what you think. What does Daggerheart's existence mean to you? And I'm not even touched on really Illuminated Worlds, what that could potentially mean for any of these other RPGs out there. The fact that it's, could that affect things like the World of Darkness, Morkborg, Call of Cthulhu, Powered by the Apocalypse? Could Illuminated World be the new one that kills all of those? It's possible. I don't know. I don't really know much about it, and we don't have a lot on it other than its shorter arc-driven campaigns, whatever that could mean. But what do you think about Daggerheart? Do you think this will be the D&D killer? Will this put down other RPG systems out there that are in development? Again, it says releasing in the next year. That means potentially from as of the 20th of April, when this post was released, to the 20th of April next year. which potentially, if it does well with its playtesting at Gen Con, could release by the end of this year, which would beat out pretty much all of the competition. Now, is that a smart move? Well, if it's ready to be released, then yes, you should release it as early as you can, as long as it's ready to go. Then you beat out everything else. And honestly, that might be even worse for folks, because if Daggerheart comes out as this amazing new system that's simplistic and clean, story-driven, and everybody loves it, you're going to lose a lot of people who are like, well, I don't even really need the 2024 revision of 5th edition or any of these other RPGs. I'm just play Daggerheart instead. And like I said, I mean, what if Critical Role gets to an active breaking point in Campaign 3, and when they come back, they decide everybody's switching over to Daggerheart? I don't know what their system's going to look like. I don't know how easy it's going to be to translate what their current characters are to Daggerheart if they decide to do it. But this is a pretty big shakeup. You know, they're one of the major players in the TTRPG streaming media spheres. And then potentially, what could this mean for the future of other stuff like the Legends of Vox Machina and their animated series, potential movies, could now be all done up again in Daggerheart, which being their own IP, if they make up lore or what have you around it, they don't have to dance around not saying certain things because they're owned by Wizards of the Coast. Like, couldn't say Bigby's Hand because Bigby's Hand is a licensed thing that's owned by Wizards of the Coast, and you'd have to pay them royalties. But if they come up with something new in Daggerheart, they could reference that because it's their IP. I really don't know what the future is going to hold. Just know that I'll continue to still be here making videos, trying to keep you up to date on what's going on. And then, yeah, I mean, it's like a console war, right? That's kind of what this feels like to me. The console wars, but for the fantasy genre of TTRPGs, right? You're going to have your people that are diehard, 5e fans, could be your Xbox fans, your Switch fans, or whatever. You're going to have all these different people out there that are, championing the different RPG systems that they love. And it could lead, I mean, if we were a little bit older, into flaming wars on message boards. I mean, I don't even know if, like, traditional forum message boards exist anymore like they used to do. But in some aspects, I guess they do. But I could see this becoming like the equivalency of the TTRPG console wars, where people are all behind the different one. And then, then it could possibly, if everybody, so like say, use that as an example, right? Let's say Daggerheart comes out mechanically on par with 5e, right? And you kind of got and you have your other, whatever ends up being your Nintendo that's a little behind the times, but continues to put out really things that are fun to play. But like, say Daggerheart and 5e are neck and neck. We'll call them sort of the Microsoft and the PlayStation in this situation, or the Microsoft and the Sony. Mechanically, they're good. Like, they're on par, like even keeled. It's going to come down to the games, right? What, the exclusives, what kind of games, what kind of modules and things are you releasing? What are your supplemental releases? How many books a year can you release? That kind of stuff. Kind of similar with what we see. Like, does a console end up being successful? Well, if it has a lot of really good games, or the games perform well, or exclusives, it's going to do better than its competition. And then, you have also someone like Nintendo who has all sorts of weird innovations. Maybe that's like the MCDM because they're looking to do stuff with their own unique dice. It's got fun and interesting, unique ways to play. And then also, it's got or maybe Dungeons and Dragons becomes this switch because they have this long history of things that they're going to rely on, like mainstay characters like Mario and Luigi and, Metroid, Zelda, all these different characters and all these different genres and games that have existed, franchises was the word I was looking for a long time. So maybe, Dungeons and Dragons becomes the switch. Like, they've got the history, and like, they can release a new book, and it's just like, hey, I love Pokemon, or I love Zelda. There's a new Zelda game coming out. I have to go play it. So you go back to Dungeons and Dragons to try out whatever it is, the new edition, the new module, and then maybe you go back to whichever you play on the regular. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. I'll see you all next time.